Today, I want to take a look at 1 Samuel 17 and the life of David. Every believer can slay their Goliaths by following David's 7 keys for overcoming giants. You're going to face giants in your life, and it's important that you prepare now to overcome them. Go ahead and turn to 2 Samuel chapter 17, and this is really a narrative of David going from being a boy, a shepherd boy, the youngest of his brothers, to becoming a man, to becoming a leader, to becoming somebody who would become King David. And these 7 principles, if you put them to practice in your life, they will help you when you face giants. They're going to help you prepare for the destiny that God has for you. So I'm going to start at verse 20. I'll give you a little bit of background. We're not going to read it all for time's sake, but Israel's at war with the Philistines, and they have a champion. His name is Goliath. He's 9 feet tall. He's very intimidating. He's taunting the Israelites, and nobody wants to fight him. So Jesse, David's father, comes and says, bring some supplies to your brothers. And so we'll take it up in verse 20. It says, early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of another shepherd and loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. Now, why is this verse there? I'm talking about just the first part of this verse. Why did the writer put this in there? What am I talking about? He left the flock with another shepherd. I think it was very intentional because it's something that's really not needed unless the narrator wants us to see something. And I checked a bunch of commentaries to see if they actually had what I saw, and I only found one. And this is what it said. This is Robert Bergen, and he says, at this first sign of morning light on the horizon, David left the flock with a shepherd. The inclusion of this subtle detail in the text highlights the fact that David was a good shepherd, a significant metaphoric image of a good leader, and increases the contrast between David and Saul. So, first of all, we love the fact that David's up morning, first light of dawn, he's out doing what his father asked him to do. But my real point here is that he was responsible. He did not move on to the next project before he finished the previous project. He would never go back, as far as we know, to being the shepherd of those sheep, but he made sure that it was taken care of. I remember when I was growing up, I never finished anything I started. I could just give you a list. Now I'm ADHD, school was not interesting to me. I read one book in high school. I wasn't a good finisher, but I had lots of ideas. I mean, to this day, I'm a visionary. I wake up with 10 ideas. But what I learned in life is that it's one thing to implement an idea. It's another thing to see it through until the end. I remember when I first came to Israel in 1990, my first visit, and my wife, Ilana, she's from here. So she stayed in Israel for another 3 weeks, and I went home. And I remember getting on the on the airplane, and I just cried because I love it here. I wanted to move here now. I wanted to move here now. And I remember that I had a responsibility at home. Not only did I have a job at home, but I was overseeing a certain ministry in our congregation that really wasn't doing all so well. And I remember what I had learned from this verse is that before I can move on to the next thing, and don't get me wrong, I know what it is to move on to the next thing. That was most of my life. It took every bit of character in me because I didn't want to. I wanted to say, you know what, forget my job, forget that. I'm getting off this plane. I'm staying in Israel. This is where my heart is. It would be another 12 years before I actually moved here. But it is so important. If you want God to use you, you have to be faithful in the job you're in now so God can put you in the next, so you'll have the character for the next job that he's going to put you in. Okay. And let me just say this. Well, David did have a prophecy that he was going to be king. Goliath wasn't on his radar. He had no idea that he was going to face a giant in his late teens. But you see, he was developing character for character's sake. Do you understand? He wasn't at home developing character, doing the right thing because he wanted to get ready for the giant. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. Develop character before you face the giant so you'll be ready. Number 2, David was zealous. Verse 26 says, David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? It hurt David to see the Lord's name blasphemed. It bothered him. And so he wasn't actually asking what will be done for the man because he wanted stuff. He was like, what do I need to do to be the guy to kill this guy? Because nobody else is going to do it. And he's blaspheming our God. You see, unlike most of these other guys, David had a relationship with God. He would spend his time shepherding the sheep with his harps, writing psalms. Some, obviously, he would write. Most he would write later. But he was cultivating a relationship with God. He loved God. He knew God. And he understood the name Yahweh, power. He was God of all the earth. And he couldn't believe that nobody was going to wipe this shame off of the face of the name of the Lord. And so he says, what will be done? Because he was willing to do it. I'm reminded of the story of Richard Wurmbrand. He was the famous Romanian Jewish pastor who went to jail for 14 years. He was in communist Romania. They had the new state-sponsored church after the communists took over. And one after another, and this, I'm reading about Nazi Germany right now in another class I'm taking and how the Nazis took over the church. One after another, it's so common, happened in China. People would come up and pledge their allegiance to the new state-sponsored church. And there's, Richard Wurmbrand sitting in the audience. And if you've ever met his wife, Sabina, they're both with the Lord now, but she was a tiny little thing. I had the privilege of hosting them one weekend many, many years ago. And she turned to her husband and she said, will you go up there and wipe the spit off of the face of our Savior? And he said, if I go up there, you will not have a husband. She said, if you don't go up there, I don't have a husband. And he went up there and he stood for the Lord and he went to jail and he suffered there. And because of that, we know today who Richard Wurmbrand is. And because of what David did as a teenager, we know today who King David was. Number 3, David did not defend himself. Verse 28 says that when Eliav, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger and he asked him, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I love how the narrator puts that in there because he's reminding us that David was faithful. He had character. He left them with another shepherd. And his brother says to him, I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. I don't know about you, but that is, that's kind of hard to overcome. But the Bible says that David turned to his brother. He said, what have I done now? Can't I even speak? And then he turned away to someone else and he brought up the same matter. Do you see that? He's tempted to defend himself. He's a little brother, right? And his big brother just called him evil and said, you've been irresponsible. He falsely accused him and he starts to defend himself, but then he turns and he brings it up, the same matter, to somebody else. He turns away from the negativity. He turns away from the false accusations to the voices in his head or the voices in our heads, and he gets back with the plan of the Lord. Listen, his brother called him wicked. He didn't just say you've been irresponsible. He called him wicked or evil. It's just a very difficult thing to overcome. I don't know if you've ever been attacked by a family member like that. Have them speak, tell you that you'll never be this, you'll never amount to anything. But that has power. The Bible says reckless words pierce like a sword. And those words, they can paralyze us when we have a dream. And I think of the great American actor, Charlie Chaplin. Listen to this. It was written about him. Arguably one of the most influential actors during the early years of film, Charlie Chaplin was no stranger to being told he would never accomplish anything. He grew up in a broken home. His parents separated when he was barely at the age of 3. His father was an alcoholic. His mother suffered from mental illness, and his childhood was wrought with hardship and poverty. Years later, with dreams of starring in films, he attempted to pitch to Hollywood executives his act. But he was rejected on the spot because they felt that his act was too ridiculous to sell to the American public. Yet despite the hardship he faced and the rejections he received, he still went on to star and direct in countless iconic films, and which completely revolutionized the film industry. Everything was against him. People were against him. Words were against him, and he overcame. Now, what are the words that are in your head that people have spoke to you that they've said you'll never accomplish anything? I think of Michael Jordan, the great, the GOAT, Michael Jordan. He was cut from his sophomore, well, he tried out for the varsity. While he was a sophomore, he was cut, and he was saying, you're too short. You're not good enough to play the game at this level. And he used that as motivation. Instead of letting that get him down, he used it as motivation to become the greatest basketball player ever. Number 4, faithful at little. And we're talking about the 7 keys, the 7 secrets to overcoming giants in your life. Verse 34 said that David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping, by the way, this is after they bring this little zealous kid to Saul, and Saul's like, what are you going to do? You're a kid. And David says to him, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it and I struck. You see, he was already getting ready. He was already building character. I went after it and struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by his hair. Don't you love David? Struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be just like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. We all know the New Testament parable, Matthew 25. This ruler gives 3 different people. One he gives 5 talents, one 2 talents, one is 1 talent. And it is interesting that it's talking about money. But it's pretty cool that they call it a talent, because that's really what this is about, is God giving us things that we can use in our life, abilities for him as first kingdom. And we know that one guy invested his 5, made 5 more. A guy invested 2, got 2 more. One guy buried it because he was scared. He was scared of taking a risk. He might lose it. He was not faithful with what he was given. And you know that famous verse? To the one with the 2 who made 2 and the one with the 5 who made 5, he says, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. You killed the lion, you killed the bear. You took care of those sheep. Now I'm going to make you a ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of the Lord. I remember several years ago, I was working for a ministry, and I was working in the media department, and I was supposed to be making these short little films. And the problem is that there was just so much turnover in the production team that we just could never get any traction. It was very frustrating to me. But then I had to meet with my employer, and they had printed or wrote a 5-page assessment of what I was doing for them. And it was really, really bad. It was very negative, and it was really wrong, because the reason I couldn't do what I wanted to do is because I didn't have the team that I was supposed to have. I love to make videos. As you can see right now, I enjoy making media. But they blamed me. And I got to be honest, I was tempted to defend myself, and I'm very good at that. There's a little demonic lawyer that lives in my head, and he loves to defend me. But I chose not to. Instead, what I did is I said, okay, that's fine. I'll tell you what, I'm going to resign. And I went down to my office. I had just recently become a pastor here in Tel Aviv. And I went down to my office and I just painted a wall green. I didn't know how to do a green screen. Painted it green. I hired an intern and we started making videos. We started making one a week. Part of my motivation was say, look, I want to do this. But let me tell you what happened. Obviously, my main motivation is I wanted to teach. And about a year later, 2 years later, I was at a conference and I was with my best friend who had just become the president of God TV. And he was at this conference, but he didn't know anybody else there. And I knew everybody. And people started coming up to me saying, hey, we love your videos. Great videos. And finally, my friend says, can I see these videos? Next thing you know, I had my own TV show on God TV. You see, and again, I'm not a great example because I am a big quitter, for most of my life. But in this situation, I just went back to my office. I was faithful with little, did what I could, ended up with a TV show. Be faithful with little, God will make you ruler over much. Number 5, David rejects Saul's armor. It says in verse 38, then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and brought a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic, and he tried walking around, but because he was not used to them, he said, I can't go in these because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream. He put them in his pouch, in a shepherd's bag, and with a sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine, the giant, Goliath. You see, David had to be David. David could not be Saul. And I think Saul's armor in this, if we're going to turn this into a parable, if you will, it represents the ways of man. And David's are the ways of the Lord, the ways of faith, the ways of trusting God. Saul's armor represents Egypt, chariots, horses, the strength of man, the arm of the flesh. And David is going after Goliath in a way to prove that the only way I'm going to win here is if God is on my side. And I recently read a story about a fellow from India by the name of Vivek Ranadive. And Vivek Ranadive, he moved to America and he decided to coach his daughter's basketball game. And as he's watching basketball, he couldn't understand something when they would, and we're right now in the time of the NBA playoffs. And when you throw the ball in, it's called inbounding the ball. Then you take the ball up the floor. The defense doesn't really attack you until you're about 20 feet away from the basket. And he's wondering, why don't they go all the way to the other end and attack them immediately? And he's thinking, what if you're shorter? What if you're not tall? This is your only chance. If you let them bring the ball down, now there is pressing and on a rare occasion, a team will press for a few minutes at a time. But Vivek was saying, I think you should do this the whole game. And so he's coaching his daughter's basketball team, and he's got 7 or 8 girls on there. And he coaches them. By the way, none of them, I think 2 of them had played basketball before. 5 had not. And he says, here's what we're going to do. He had 2 rules. And the second rule was this. We are going to press the entire game. They ended up going to the championship. And in the interview, his daughter tells the interviewer, my dad had never played basketball before. You see, if he had done it the way everybody else had done it, his short girls who weren't great basketball players would not have won. He had to do it his way, and they ended up going to the championship. And just like David, if he had gone in Saul's armor, he would not have been victorious. He had to go in the armor of God. Number 6, David did not cave into intimidation. As he comes to Goliath, he says, Goliath says to him, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I will give your flesh to the birds and to the wild animals. I just want you to imagine this. You have a giant coming at you, and he's mad. He's angry. He's double your size. He's triple your weight, probably more than triple. And he's going to break you in half. That's intimidating. Words can be intimidating. Somebody attacking you can be intimidating. When I lived in Ukraine back in 1998-99, I had a a horrible experience one day. I am not particularly a brave person. Before I was a believer, if ever I was going to get in a fight, a physical fight, I would find every way possible not to fight. I had friends that enjoyed getting in fist fights. I never understood that. And now I'm in Ukraine, and I've got my wife there, and I've got my 3 girls there. And one day there's a knock at my door, and Goliath answers the door. I'm not joking. He was Ukrainian mafia, and he was angry, and he walked into my apartment. He pushed me aside, and he starts yelling at me in Russian. I don't know what's going on. I don't speak Russian. And so I understood one word he said, vada. Vada means water. And in the apartment buildings in Ukraine, at least at that time, 22 years ago, water could leak from one apartment to the next. It was a very common thing. And he owned the Reebok store, which wasn't really a store. It was for money laundering. But he owned it. And he was telling me, I understood just from context, that he was saying water's coming from my apartment into his Reebok store. And I was like, no, it's not. And I opened up the door to my bathroom, which is where our washing machine was. Again, if I got to take you to Ukraine sometime. But, and pray for Ukraine. Obviously, it's dear to my heart because we live there and we know people there, and we're continuing our ministries, raising funds and supporting them, and we continue to pray for them. But he said, and I opened the door, and I saw 3 inches of water on the floor coming from my washing machine. And he looked at me and he said, well, I found out later. I had to go down to the Reebok store because he cut my water off. And I found an interpreter, went to his Reebok store, and he said, I'm going to cut off your water, which he'd already done. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to have you thrown out of this country. This is a mafia guy. If you looked at this guy's face, I have no doubt that he had personally killed people. I had no doubt. And he's threatening me. And I'm just a little guy. And I am not a brave person. And it was a Friday, and we didn't have water the entire weekend. And I didn't know what. I was just utterly intimidated, terrified. But finally, I was walking home from the Bible school that I taught. And it was a beautiful winter day. Sky was clear. In Ukraine, you can have 3 weeks of gray skies. And it was just a beautiful day. And I'm praying. I'm scared. And I'm telling God, I'm scared. I don't know what to do, God. I want to run away and go home. And the Lord, I believe, reminded me of the story of Elisha and his servant. When, you know the story, the servant was nervous that they were going to attack, and he said, Lord, open his eyes. There he saw chariots, angels and chariots, and he said, there are more with us than against us. And God was saying to me, Ron, one of me with you is all you need. He can't touch you. Don't worry about it. And so it was that afternoon that I went back to his office, and I had to face him. I didn't want to. And we were getting ready to go home for a month to America. And my plan was to go home and never come back. But I went in the office. I talked to the guy. Something happened in the middle of that conversation, and his stone face softened, and he ended up turning our water back on. I never saw him again. I saw him one time after that walking down the street, but I never saw him again. So we have to learn to overcome intimidation, and it's not easy. And again, when somebody comes at you and they're intent on hurting you, or they use evil words against you, or they try and put you down. I think of Jezebel when she said to Elijah, she said, tomorrow at this time, I'm going to make your life like one of those prophets that you killed. And he ran for his life. After his greatest moment in ministry, his greatest moment of revival, he got intimidated by a woman. I'm just assuming, based on physics and chemistry and every other, and biology. I failed biology too, but that Elijah was able to, physically, just him and Jezebel in the octagon, I don't know. Normally, a man can not be beat up by a woman. But she had a spirit on her. We call that the spirit of Jezebel, which is the spirit of intimidation. He was the prophet of God. That was the highest office in the land. It was the prophet who would rebuke the king, not the other way around. And he ran from her because of the spirit of intimidation. And look at Saul and all the armies of Israel. At the beginning of the chapter, verse 10, it says, then the Philistines said this day, I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man, let us fight each other. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. They gave in to the spirit of intimidation. Do you remember Happy Days? I don't know how old each of you are, but when I grew up, there was this great show called Happy Days. I used to watch it every week. There was Richie Cunningham, who was just kind of this normal kid, a gingy, we say in Hebrew, red hair. And then there was, the cool guy, Fonzie. Everybody was afraid of Fonzie. And Richie, in this episode, is about to get in a fight. And he doesn't want to fight. And so he's asking Fonzie for advice. And he says, just act like you're crazy. And so Richie, terrified, goes out there and he just goes berserk on these guys, ends up pulling the guy's jacket over him, and they end up running away, even though they could have beaten up Richie. He intimidated them. Now, I'm not teaching you how to intimidate. I'm showing you the power of intimidation. The fact of the matter is that God plus David was all that was needed. I should say David plus God was all that was needed. Saul plus God was all that was needed. Anybody in that army plus God was all that was needed to defeat Goliath. But they gave into intimidation. Number 7, David trusted in God. Verse 45. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day, I love this. I just love David. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animal, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. David was doing this as an evangelist. He was doing this to say to everyone there and everyone that would read about this, that the God of Israel is the God of all the earth. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Hallelujah. I just can't say enough about the importance of living a faith-filled life. I know there are excesses in what we call the word of faith movement, but don't let that cause you not to live a faith-filled life. Believe God for healing. Believe God for finances. Believe God to use you. Believe God for great things. Believe God that you're going to be able to raise hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars to bless other people. Right? Not to get a jet, to bless other people, to preach the gospel, to do humanity. Believe God. It just touches God's heart when we trust him. And I have to say this. You don't get to that place of faith without facing giants. David could not have seen God move on his behalf unless he accepted the challenge. And that takes faith. I remember when I moved to Israel for the first many years, I just didn't know how we were going to survive financially. We lived on support. Not enough was coming in. And once I had to start paying taxes here, we pay about half of our income in taxes. It's crazy. Tel Aviv, where I live, is the most expensive city in the world. And I was just double-minded. I always had like this idea, well, I can always go back to America and be a pastor, Messianic rabbi. And one day, when I was just wrestling and I was being double-minded again, Shira Sukaram, I don't know if you know of her, but her and her husband Ari, they birthed Ma'oz Israel Ministry. Her parents were Frida and Gordon Lindsay from Christ for the Nations. And they were part of the healing revivals back in the 50s. And her dad was one of the only ministers out of that movement that had a longevity in his ministry. Started Christ for the Nations, of course. And so she understood faith. And she looked at me. I'm telling her this. I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe we'll go. She said, you need the gift of faith. She said, you need to decide right now, has God called you here or has he not? And when she said that to me, it was like something just jumped on me. Something good jumped on me. It was like a gift of faith, as we read about in 1 Corinthians 12. And at that moment, I said, God, I trust you. I believe you. I'll not be double-minded again. This is my home. You will provide. Not only have I never doubted since that day, I have never had a deep financial need. Never skipped a paycheck. And Our Ministry Messiah's Mandate last year, we gave over $500,000 away. We continue to give money. We've never had to worry about money since that day. Well, there you have it, my friends. That is how every believer can slay their Goliath by just following these principles, these 7 keys that David used to slay Goliath. Now, as I close, let me just summarize over these principles. Number 1, again, take care of what you're doing now before you jump to something else. Number 2, David was zealous. Number 3, David chose not to defend himself, but to stay focused. He overcame very negative words. Number 4, he was faithful at little. God made him king over Israel. Number 5, he didn't go in the armor of man. He went in the armor of God. Number 6, David did not cave into intimidation. And number 7, he trusted in God. As I close here, let me just say this. The fact is, David was preparing to slay Goliath long before he ever met him, long before he ever knew him. As a child, as a shepherd, he was already developing his character, his faith, his life, so that in the future, he would be ready to slay Goliath. You know, I think of President Zelensky in Ukraine. Nobody expected Zelensky to become president. He was not only an actor, comedian, he was trained as a lawyer. He played a president on TV for several seasons. And suddenly he not only became president, but he has galvanized the world. He's been an example of faith and of courage and of being willing to risk your life for your country. And I just don't believe that one day he just said, I'm going to be this man. He ran on a platform. In fact, his entire show was about this humble school teacher who rails against corruption and suddenly becomes president of Ukraine. But that's kind of like them. He wasn't a humble teacher. He was a lawyer actor. But somewhere in his life, he had developed these character qualities so that when it demanded him, when time demanded of him, he was ready to take his stand. And when the Americans came in, when President Biden called him up and said, we'll get out of here, and he said, I don't need a ride, I need weapons. You don't get that overnight. You don't get that from playing games and being just a Hollywood actor and then suddenly being thrust into the limelight. You get that from developing character all your life. So who knows where God is leading you, but I do know this. Now is the time to put those 7 principles in effect in your life so that you'll be ready to face Goliath when he shows up. God bless you.